Black, Indigenous, Afro-Latinx, and Latinx women showed up strong this election, and it's thanks to organizers of color that we owe this electoral victory.
That's right. It's through organizing that we got here, and it's through organizing that will take us where we need to go. We have given Joe Biden a mandate to take bold action on climate change, COVID-19, and racial injustice. And we will be here every step of the way to make sure that he does.
The work doesn't stop here. It's just the beginning. La lucha continúa. For the past 4 years, we have cared for one another. And now we must come together to ensure our government cares for us and to see that everyone, no matter their race or where they come from, has what they need to thrive.
To inspire us in this fight for a world beyond fossil fuels, a world in which workers' rights, community health, and our shared climate comes before corporate profits, we'll be discussing art and resistance. This interview was recorded in October, so you might hear some references about preparing for the election.
Today on the show, we have art powerhouse Favianna Rodriguez. Favianna is an Afro-Peruvian that was raised in Oakland, California, where she still lives. She's the co-founder of presidenta.org and is the president of the Center of Cultural Power, a national arts organization that engages artists, writers, and performers in migrant rights. You might have seen her work, including Ben & Jerry's Pecan Resist, 2 large-scale public art commissions with the city of San Francisco, and her iconic installation, Migration is Beautiful. Welcome, Favianna.
Thank you for being with us today. So we want to get started right away and just hear all about how you were drawn to art and what, where did you grow up? Just tell us a little bit about yourself and tell us why you started with making such beautiful art.
I grew up in Oakland, California. My parents were both Peruvian immigrants, and I grew up in a Latinx neighborhood, largely in a Black and brown city, which Oakland was throughout the 80s and 90s. And what inspired me was really the conditions under which I grew up. It was the era of the war on drugs, and Oakland was a very dangerous place to live in. I witnessed police brutality, I witnessed government neglect, and my community was also very polluted. And it was a community in which food apartheid was rampant. And so I always understood that I was a part of a community that was being neglected by our government. And I just realized that I lived in a hood that just wasn't right. It wasn't right that we were subjected to this kind of treatment, and I would go to another country and things would feel so different. And so for me, it was important to create another world for myself. And that's why I would draw a lot. And I felt that by being able to draw and create art, that I could have agency over my conditions and really what existed in my mind. I unfortunately lost a lot of my peers to drugs and to the prison industry. And I was one of the few people in my community who went to college. And so I always felt that art was a way to imagine another reality, but also to make that reality real in a form, in an object that I could then show to other people. And so for me, being an artist is about creating new narratives.
Your illustrations have become synonymous with grassroots efforts to defend a variety of issues, from immigration, women's rights, food justice, environmental and racial justice, etc. And as you've said, it definitely inspired you, but what came first, your art or your role as an activist, or can you separate the two things?
I think I can't separate the two things because art was a response to conditions. And I was also an activist since I was very young. I mean, I walked out my high school when I was 16, and I got involved in activism as a teenager because in my state, my home state of California, in 1994, one of the worst anti-immigrant pieces of law passed. And it was the first time that a state undertook immigration policy, which largely had lived in the federal realm. And it was also the year that California was passing all kinds of incarceration laws, like 3 strikes, you're out, right? And which was basically giving people lifetime sentences for 3 felonies. And it was the end of affirmative action. And so California, while we know it today as a very progressive state, was not like that in the 90s. There was a lot of fear because Latinos were becoming a huge majority in the state. And we saw those signs since the 90s when the census came out, which is actually indicates how important it is for people to take the census, because laws change as a result of the census. And so for me, finding my power in my voice was very much parallel to finding my power as a creator. And back then, you know, we didn't have laptops. I had a desktop computer, the first Mac model, and I learned how to make flyers on my mom's Xerox machine. And so I would make all the flyers for my school events and put them up. And I felt that my best contribution was in making things that would move people to action. So the earliest things I made were flyers for the meetings that I had in the Latino club that I founded. I founded the first Latinx club in my high school and helped have the first Raza Day and helped do walkouts, right, around schools, not jails. That was our demand back then. It's now something that's been very popularized, but I was a young person when that happened. And so I feel like art is necessary also to organize, because we have to make the things that we want to inspire people. We can't just give people data. We actually have to make things that sparks their imagination, whether that's a poster or a mural or a show, right? It's important that we actually make those things, because then, you know, folks can engage with something that is emotional, that actually is about a story and isn't just, you know, data.
I mean, your art is so recognizable, and when I see it, it's like this deep diversity of people. It's beautiful. It shows a lot of strength, and it really captures the injustices and power struggles that exist in this country. Can you just tell me a little bit more about like why you choose to depict the things that you do and how you kind of get to that end?
Yeah, I feel like I depict the things that have most affected me, and it's because I know that in them affecting me, they affect so many other people. And I believe that so much of our human experiences are actually universal, right? And so I am in the body of a woman who is the daughter of an Afro-Peruvian man. And I've experienced growing up in a mixed race immigrant family. And so when I create, I do things from that perspective. My figures that I draw are they have facial features that are very indigenous and African. And that's because I would see my grandmother, right? And I saw how she looked. And so I wanted to depict her. Part of the reason why I do artwork around sexual freedom and sexual liberation is because growing up, the messages that I got around sex were so negative. It was about keep your legs closed, don't get pregnant. I ended up getting pregnant and having abortions as a young person. Well, I mean, as a college student, precisely because the stories that I was being told about my body were just very harmful. I make art around the environment because I actually grew up in a concrete city. I didn't really understand or go camping too often. And so I recognize that many people of color, our connection to nature has been severed. And so I make art about reclaiming that. I make art about my plants because I feel that it's part of my healing work is to reconnect to nature. And when you live in an urban jungle, the way to do that is through gardening and through plants. I'm a vegan, and I choose to be a vegan because food systems are destroying our environment. And those who are directly impacted are people from my community. I mean, the people working in slaughterhouses and in agricultural fields are all Latinx. And so I don't want to contribute to that, but I also want to talk about why. I want to show images of why, of how we can actually transform how we eat while we hold, the fossil fuel companies accountable, while we hold factory farms and really, food is creating 1/3 of our emissions. And so for me, all of those stories, they intersect because the other thing is, in my community, people overwhelmingly die because of food related diseases, and now they're dying because of COVID. My community is the #1 community impacted by COVID in my county, in Alameda County, my community, the Fruitvale. And the reason is because Latinos are in the front lines. Latinx people are doing the essential jobs. And so I make work about all of those things because it's about processing those things. It's not just about reading the data and seeing how many people are affected, but actually making a statement about it and making something that is an object that is going to live on even longer than me, right? I could write a poem, I could make an object, I could make a short film. And that is acknowledging what is happening. And if we don't do that, the issue is that our issues are not covered in the mainstream media, hardly. We still have, especially as Latinx people, there's a big invisibility happening. And so it is very, very important to create art and things that reflect our lived experience.
On the topic of the environment and the climate, we know that the climate crisis intersects with so many issues that immigrants and people of color face. So migration, economic justice, food insecurity, as you touched, racism. How are you seeing conversations about the climate and the environment change in the last few years? Where do you see it going?
Well, first, it's critical to name that the climate crisis is the result of racial capitalism. It's the result of colonial systems of extraction that we still live with today. And it's the results of patriarchy, because frankly, the people who are running the fossil fuel companies are white men. What they do to our earth, the way they extract, is a domination, and it's an assault. It's an assault on the body of the earth. And I think that over the last few years, we have seen that conversations on climate cannot ignore the fact that the climate crisis is the consequence of a white supremacist system. These are the ways we interact with our environment have all been informed by colonization, extraction, and really what Greta Thunberg calls fairy tales of endless consumption. It's a fairy tale. It's actually a story. It's a constructed story because we cannot extract like that. As I've been experiencing the wildfires here in California and learning also in the last few years, really taking an interest to understand what happened here. And what happened here is that entire ecosystems were wiped out. We used to have otters, and there was an industry that wiped out the otters, made them extinct. The bears, we're called the Golden State. There's a reason we have a bear. All of these things wiped out. The systems that indigenous people had for forest management have been wiped out. And we're actually experiencing the consequences of emissions that happened 30, 40, 50 years ago. So what I'm seeing shift is an acknowledgement that we can't talk about the climate crisis in this way that equally affects all humans, because that's just not true. Where the oil companies have decided to put their projects is in communities of color. And that's not a surprise. When you look at who's running these companies, it's practically all white men. And so I think that what has been really amazing and powerful is to see the ways in which Black liberation and really a global movement for Black liberation has made it so that the climate sector, the environmental sector can no longer kind of hide behind this frame in which we identify as all humans who are all together responsible for what's happening, because that's just not true. White people are overwhelmingly responsible. I mean, the majority of the emissions are caused by the wealthiest people. There is a lot of data that shows that white people are creating pollution. The people who are experiencing the brunt of it are people of color. I mean, here in my home state, in the Central Valley. The Central Valley is where 2/3 of the country's food comes from. And guess who's working there? It's all Latinx, and their air is the dirtiest in the country. And so we can't disconnect these things. And I am glad that we are finally at a place where the conversations are changing and where movements are connecting the dots. But we have a ways to go. And, as somebody who runs an organization, I can tell you that environmental philanthropy is giving less than like 3% of their money to climate leaders of color. So even though we're the most affected, we actually get we don't get the resources to solve what we need to solve. And that is a continuation of a white supremacist system that prioritizes white voices. I have faith that these things are changing. They're not changing fast enough, but I do feel that the pandemic, together with Black liberation, is really going to create the conditions for us to say enough. Like, you cannot have a climate movement without Indigenous, Black, young people at the center of it. And impacted communities have to be at the table, like not just for solutions, but for thinking about what are the narratives that we need to win. And of course, we have to vote. I mean, what the current administration has done around easing the exploitation of our Mother Earth, and not just that. I mean, the bailouts to the oil industry, don't even get me started. It's just like such a sham. It's such a sham. And it's just awful to me to know that how many people are losing their jobs and their sources of income and their ability to sustain themselves. And these oil companies that have oil sitting in cargo in the ocean because nobody is using it and they want bailouts. And now they're talking about plastics in Africa.
Totally. I mean, you just hit on like everything that I've been working on for the last, year. Like, we cannot, replicate the same extractivist systems. We cannot dismantle the master's house with the master's tools. I mean, all of these things, and the plastic industry sort of trying to replace the fossil fuel industry because they know they're a dying industry. It's just such a mess. But I do really feel that like there's so much power in the movement for Black lives, and seeing that happen right in front of us, especially during this time, has been like so powerful, I think, for a lot of people. And I don't know what we will feel like in November when this airs, but so I kind of want to talk a little bit about that. So the uprising for Black lives, the election, the climate crisis, I know you've been super busy. So what are you working on? What's next for you? And like, I've seen that you've done a lot of cool projects that folks can do in their homes because of the COVID pandemic. What are you up to? What are the cool things you're working on?
I'm working on a whole new series of intersectional content. So for example, I love being a vegan and I love talking about sex. So how do I combine those two things to educate people both on how they can prioritize their pleasure while helping the environment, right? I love to be an environmentalist, and I also love to be a feminist. And how can those things come together? I'm a very joy-oriented person. I don't think that doom and gloom are going to move us. And so I'm experimenting with how to combine those things in a sexy, fun, and compelling way. And that could mean, I'm thinking about doing some very sexy content. I would love to explore a show that talks about, also in the time of pandemic, how we as communities can relate to each other while also changing our behaviors, right? Because, you know, as somebody who I used to fly once a week and I don't fly anymore. And I realized that things are really changing in terms of how people are acting, but we need to see things modeled for us, right? So if something is transitioning away, what are we doing instead? What are the new behaviors? I'm really excited about what's possible, because what this pandemic is also doing is it's revealing the utter failures of our old systems. I mean, of the patriarchy. It's revealing just how broken our healthcare system. It's revealing just how useless oil is, and that we need new food systems. I mean, it's just horrific that you have farm workers who are working in weather that every single year is getting hotter, breaking records. How are we adapting, right? And so that's the kind of those are the kinds of projects that I'm very excited about.
We're excited about them too.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing, and thank you so much for joining us today on Planeta. Hey, you are such an inspiration, Favianna. Seriously, we're in awe and just forever thankful that you came on the show. So thanks again.
Thanks so much for joining us once again on Planeta G. If you know a Latinx artist in your community and you think we should follow them, please let us know in the comments below. And as always, if you have any questions, please drop them in the comments and we'll try to answer them in the next episode.
Be sure to hit that subscribe button so you know exactly when a new Planeta G episode drops, and follow us on Instagram at Greenpeace USA. Catch you guys next time. Bye.
Besito.